Thank you, Laskin Corla. Minister, this question is about the situation in Sudan and what's happening there and how the government is attacking the peaceful demonstrators there. And, and after an incredibly peaceful removal of a 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, the military junta, now known as the Transitional Military Council, is refusing to hand over power to civilians. I'm just asking what the Irish government are going to do in relation to that situation.
2 minutes.
Okay. The recent political events and violence against protesters in Sudan follows over 6 months of demonstrations triggered initially by the spiralling cost of living. On the 11th of April, it was announced that President Omar al-Bashir had been removed from power and that a transitional military council had assumed control in Sudan. Demonstrators, while welcoming the removal of al-Bashir, continued to demonstrate for a civilian-led government. Final agreement regarding a civilian majority on a proposed 11-member Supreme Council was opposed by the Transitional Military Council, and negotiations were stalled. Shortly after dawn on the 3rd of June, heavily armed security forces surrounded demonstrators and shot indiscriminately, with live bullets and tear gas resulting in a significant loss of life. The same day, the TMC announced that it was cancelling all agreements with the opposition and announced elections would be held within 9 months. Demonstrators demanded a longer period to guarantee fair elections. On the 3rd of June, the EU High Representative Mogherini stated that there can be no justification for the use of force to disperse peaceful protests and that the TMC is accountable for security and the rule of law in the country. I also issued a statement strongly condemning the use of violence and excessive force against protesters. The EU Foreign Affairs Council met on the 17th of June, yesterday, to discuss Sudan. The EU 28 statement issued following the meeting, which condemned the violence against protesters, including sexual and gender-based violence, it also expressed EU support for the African Union, which has taken a principled and robust stance to the crisis. My officials continue to actively monitor developments in Sudan through the Embassy of Ireland in Nairobi and through the European Union delegation in Khartoum. Senior officials from my department also met with the Sudanese ambassador to Ireland earlier this year to discuss the situation. Ireland continues to respond to ongoing humanitarian needs through the provision of humanitarian funding, with over €29 million provided through our UN, NGO and Red Cross partners since 2012.
Deputy Pringles for supplementary.
Minister, it's a very serious situation, and there's a lot of Sudanese citizens in Ireland, particularly doctors and stuff like that, in Ireland that are very concerned in relation to what is happening there. And I think it's very welcome that the EU statement and that Ireland has supported the EU statement yesterday in relation to the African Union and the establishment of a civilian-led authority. But what will the EU do to ensure that that actually takes place, and what additional supports can you offer to the African Union to allow them to broker that taking place, because it's vitally important that this government, that so-called government, be removed, because that ultimately is what is the only thing that can ensure the safety of the people, is that actually is moved back to democratic control and to that a government elected by the people can reflect it, and I think that's vitally important. So I would be interested to hear what you actually intend to do over and above to ensure that they're making the statements.
Thanks for observing the time, Tánaiste. Same for you. 1 minute.
I'll try to respond to that. The African Union has demonstrated robust and principled leadership in response to the crisis since the Transitional Military Council assumed power in Sudan on the 11th of April. It set the 30th of June as the deadline for the transfer to a civilian authority, and on the 6th of June decided with immediate effect to suspend Sudan from participation in all African Union activities until the effective establishment of a civilian-led transitional authority. This followed sustained but ultimately unsuccessful engagement with Sudan in the weeks since the Transitional Military Council seized control. This decision was publicly supported by the EU in a statement by the EU High Representative. I welcome the appointment of an African Union Special Envoy for Sudan, who has been tasked to mediate between the authorities and the opposition, and who joined the FAC this week to inform EU foreign ministers in relation to his activities. So we will continue to support the African Union, which I think is the way forward to try to get an outcome here.
First supplementary.
Very welcome, and I just want to make sure that the European Union wouldn't be carrying out any talks with the government, unilateral talks, but would actually be going through the African Union, because I think that's vitally important that a united front would be upheld, and to show that this situation is totally unacceptable, and what has to happen is that transition to civilian power has to take place in order to deal with the situation, and just that you would make sure that the European Union would fully support the African Union to ensure that this takes place. Thanks.
Final response, 1 minute.
I think the EU has made the judgment call here. I wasn't at the meeting, as I said, this week because I was in Belfast, but Helen McEntee was there, and I'll talk to her about it. But I do think that the EU's judgment is right here. I think this needs to be an African-led solution, and I think this is an important intervention by the African Union. Suspending Sudan was a significant statement, I think, in response to what was happening. And I think the EU now needs to be very clear and unambiguous in support of the need for a civilian-led government and the facilitation of free and fair elections within the right time frame.